Thank you to Helen, and thank you to all of you for being here, because having chatted with a couple of you so far, I realize I am actually not the expert in the room. Those of you who have children in this age group are probably far more expert than I am, and who work with people in this age group. So as Helen said, I really am looking forward to some good engagement afterwards and as we go. So please be taking mental notes of things you disagree with, things you agree with, things you want to challenge, and we'll have a rich evening together. I arrived on the University of Nottingham's campus at 1:30 in the afternoon last Monday. And proud I was that I had managed to taxi a plane, a bus, and a walk without getting lost. But I hadn't had any lunch, so I knew I needed to somehow get myself into town to find something to eat. Because I am so directionally challenged, I also knew I needed to ask for directions before I set out. It was Easter break, however, so it was very hard to find anyone on campus to talk to. As I set out from the dormitory where I had left my bag, I spotted a young woman slowly walking across campus, earbuds in, looking intently at her phone. But she was the only human being in sight, so I had no choice. I slowly made my way towards her and asked if she was a student here and might she be able to give me directions to a shop where I could find a sandwich. She quickly warned me that she was only a first year and she wasn't sure she could get me exactly to the shop I wanted to get to. However, she was walking in the direction of town and I could go with her as far as she was going. Now, while I was grateful that my chances of getting lost had been significantly diminished with my escort, the stronger emotion I felt was surprise. This girl had stopped, put away her phone, offered to help a stranger, and in our 10-minute conversation down the street, she appeared genuinely sincere, thoughtful, and caring. Her name was Sam, and at 19 years old, she's a good example of the age cohort we're looking at tonight. And I'll come back to her story in a little bit. The purpose of our coming together this evening is to think about the current generation of emerging adults in this postmodern context. And towards this end, I have three objectives. First of all, to survey some of the current data about this cohort. Secondly, to offer some theological reflections based on these statistical trends. And they are only trends, but we have to start our conversation there. And then finally, to encourage conversation among all of us as to what import, if any, these discoveries, these findings might have on how we engage with our young adults. Now, any group of people, such as we are tonight, come with a range of expectations, and one of my problems is I don't know exactly what yours are. So I want to just mention two caveats at the beginning. One, I am an academic, so that is the lens through which I look at this subject. However, I am also a practitioner insofar as this age group is the group with which I work on a daily basis. So I find this subject and these findings of personal significance to me. Secondly, it's impossible to deal exhaustively with the sea of information that exists on millennials and Generation Z. So we can only dip our toes into the material tonight. And many of you do have extensive experience in this field, and it's important that we have time to learn from you and to learn together. The focus this evening is our current generation of the 18-year-old plus age group, young people. This coming of age years, this ambiguous transition between childhood and adulthood is a critical period of human development. The children becoming young adults are the primary agents in this process, but humans have always lived in a networked society, and that network plays a pivotal role in this transition. And I hope tonight we all here believe that the church also has a vocational purpose in that period of their lives. Now, I'm a theologian and not a sociologist, so I depend on others for the sociological insights that feed into some of the thinking I've done here. And if my research for tonight has done anything for me, it's to impress upon me how much more I have to learn, both from our young adults and with them. We will proceed as follows. Firstly, we need to briefly define our terms that boundary our reflections. Secondly, we'll describe the situation of those in the 18 to 24 age range, what some scholars term emerging adults. Thirdly, in light of these observations, I, as a theologian, will offer 3 reflections based on the Christian story of what it means to be human for these emerging adults. And then it will be over to you to take the conversation where you want to take it and to feedback together. In order to get us all on the same page at the start, we need to start with defining some terms. And there are 3 in the publicity for this evening that I need to just mention. The postmodern, millennials, and Generation Z. So, postmodern or postmodernity. Though we could spend the whole evening discussing and debating this term, we take it simply as an indicator of the reality that we have moved well beyond modernity. Modernity being that period of Western history that's been shaped by a meta-narrative, shaped by a big story, a big explanation of reality that helps to make sense of our experience of the world. In our case in the West, that story was founded on the Judeo-Christian worldview. And both the character and the presence of God contributed to defining principles of our culture, such as justice, the value of the human person, the rightful place of government, and the role of religion in public life. That's modernity. Then postmodernity, we're told, is the erosion of belief in any meta-narrative, in any big story or explanation of reality that everyone broadly adhered to, or at least understood. Now, this rejection of postmodernity gave rise to oftentimes conflicting ways of understanding who we are, of understanding the world in which we live and the meaning of human existence. Postmodernity is a recognition then that the defining framework of Western society continues to change even beyond that postmodern or postmodernity period, and to change dramatically. And in our thinking about who we are, about the world in which we live, and about the people around us, and also about God, we need to be aware of that change as we consider what we believe and how we engage with the world. Now, 2 more terms require explanation. When it comes to generation studies, millennials and Generation Z are usually considered separate cohorts, and there are similarities and also differences across the 1994-1995 divide. While there is no universal agreement on cutoff dates, and these dates can be disputed, the ones I'm working with for the sake of conversation tonight are that millennials, also known as Generation Y, were born between 1980 and 1994. Generation Z picks up in 1995 and goes to around 2010. You will recall that baby boomers span the years 1946 to 1963, and Generation X 1964 to 1979. I belong to Generation X. We have 1 or 2 Gen Z here tonight. And many of you belong to Generation X boomers, or also what's called the silent generation, those who are older than 70. And while I trace a broad sketch here, we have to always keep in mind that generations are inherently diverse and complex groups and not simple caricatures. And hopefully we'll see that at the very end of this paper. Millennials were becoming adults around the turn of the millennium. In broad brush strokes, they are characterized by an awareness of 9/11 and by the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. They were the first generation of voting age to welcome a black president in the US, and they are racially and ethnically diverse. They've been influenced by economic recession, during which some were looking for their first employment. They are confident, entrepreneurial, and ready to lead. Generation X grew up as the computer revolution was taking hold, while this generation, millennials, came of age during the internet explosion. Generation Z, then, also called iGen, for its link with the iPhone, was already underway in the year 2000. A central influence of this generation was the commercialization in the year of the internet, in the year they were born, 1995. They have never known a world without the web, without social media or smartphones. When Facebook opened up to anyone over the age of 13 in 2006, they were poised and ready to participate. Like millennials, Generation Z, their world is colored by financial recession, though unlike any previous generation, they have been shaped by the normalization of gender fluidity. This generation will less remember Barack Obama than Donald Trump, and theirs is truly a brave new world, except members of Generation Z don't realize exactly what is brave or new about it. For them, this is just normal. Because I cannot speak across both generations in their entirety, for the purpose of our conversation this evening, we focus mostly on Generation Z, just at the tail end of millennials, those born between 1994 and 2000. This is, those born between them. This is not just for the sake of conversation, but it's also because this is the age range of many of our students at BBC. So personal interest to many here tonight. Now, just one word about BBC and Northern Ireland. One of the challenges of doing research in Northern Ireland, especially when it comes to religion and theology, is that it doesn't fit the stereotypes of Ireland, Great Britain, or the US, which are the fields of where most of the social and sociological research take place. So for this reason, it's important to qualify every single piece of data that I used, but if we do that, we will be here till Friday morning. So I'm going to ask you to work with me and for the purpose of conversation, say that this movement of secularization that has already impacted in England and the US and Western Europe will soon define our own context. It very probably is more a matter of when and not if. So then, on to our subject matter, and I start with identifying three characteristics that are generally true across this cohort of emerging adults. Nones, no religious affiliation, inclusive, tolerant, and safe, and digital natives. A first observation that we make of these emerging adults is that because postmodernity was a clear rejection of meta-narratives, or the big story that makes sense of life, there is no longer the socially formed awareness of God or sin or salvation or Christ that characterized both the boomers and Generation Z, and to a certain extent, the millennial generation. In this light, James Emery White suggests people today aren't merely secularized. They're not thinking about religion and rejecting it. They're not thinking about religion at all. It should be said here that there is still a cultural residue of Christianity in Northern Ireland, though there is little confidence that this will remain for long. White labels this decline or even this absence of faith as functional atheism. Rather than rejecting the idea of God, our culture simply ignores him. Such functional atheists have come to be known as nones, N-O-N-E-S, because they register on census questionnaires as of no religious faith. This reality has been corroborated by research statistics aired as recently as mid-March that nearly 3/4 of young Britons identify as having no religion. This study finds that the proportion of young adults, you see there the age range 16 to 29, with no religious affiliation in the UK is 70%. Alongside this, only 21% of British young adults identify as Christian, and only 7% of young adults in the UK identify as Anglican, compared to 6% as Muslims. In her book, her 2017 publication entitled iGen, Why Today's Superconnected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, Jean Twenge suggests that more and more millennials and iGeners are less religious both publicly and privately. The waning of private religious beliefs means that younger generations' disassociation from religion is not just about their distrust in institutions. More are disconnecting from religion entirely, even at home and even in their hearts. This is visible in the decline across all 4 private religious beliefs, such as praying, believing in God, believing the Bible is the Word of God, and believing in an afterlife. Now, let me say that a majority always leaves a minority. And the minority of young adults who are living lives of committed discipleship to Jesus Christ and who do have an active and vibrant faith, they really, really matter for both their peers and the church. And we are very privileged at BBC to have some of them studying with us, and we'll come back to this minority in a few moments. We pause then for a couple questions. Who then is God for our young adults? If these researchers are correct, the question actually is no longer who is God or what is God like. There actually is no God question at all. How does this impact the testimony of a church whose discourse appears, at least on the surface, as utterly disconnected from the questions our young adults are asking? A second characteristic of today's 18 to 24 age group is the discomfort many feel with disagreement and exclusion of others. Because of this, they are less likely than previous generations to accept conflict, even over major issues. For some, the desire for acceptance they feel is actually incompatible with the church, which they view as exclusivist. The perception is that Christians have an insider-outsider mentality that is always ready to bar the door to those who don't meet their standards. This view is true of both those who have left the church and those who have never engaged with church, the nones we just mentioned. The church's alleged exclusivity flies in the face of young adults' collective values and reference points. As Kinnaman notes, tolerance has been the cultural North Star for most of Generation Z's upbringing. Inclusiveness, diversity, and political correctness are ideals that have shaped this generation. So when it comes to speaking into the lives of our young people, great care is needed given the fact that for them, accepting means affirmation. If you don't affirm, you don't accept. Alongside this need for acceptance is also a need for safety. Worries about physical safety have hounded parents across the generations, even if the young people themselves were completely disregarded the risks they were taking. What is a growing trend among Generation Z in particular, though, is the need for emotional and psychological safety as well. Theirs was the childhood of the car seat, says one sociologist, of being picked up at school instead of walking home by yourself, of sanitized plastic playgrounds. Boomer and Gen X kids, free to roam around the neighborhoods, have been replaced by iGen kids, supervised at every moment. Now, for all the potential benefits of so-called helicopter parenting, there are also drawbacks from this emphasis on security. Many in Generation Z feel the need to be protected from emotional disruption and hurt. They seek safe spaces. That's become a term in their world. Safe spaces, which has come to include being protected from everything that might threaten, hearkening back to the childhood that they still need and desire. American college campuses, for example, are becoming places where the focus is now on students' emotional states rather than on their intellectual development, sacrificing challenging discussions for the possibility that a student might feel upset. As one professor wrote, emotional discomfort is now regarded as equivalent to material injury, and all injuries have to be remediated. Now, it's easy to see that there are internal contradictions here. I am not tolerant if I require others to change their behavior or language or values so that I am not hurt or offended. There is also the issue that tolerance is not love, and tolerance cannot create the kind of intimacy of relationship and community that we all need. So, how can we help our young adults know the safety of love and the grace of mutual trust? How can we be inclusive in our interactions and also honest in our relationships? A third observation, and perhaps the single most unique factor in shaping millennials and Generation Z, is the defining role in their lives of technology, especially social media. Twenge posits, today's teens have come to adolescence in a time when their primary social activity is staring at a small rectangular screen that can like or reject them. The devices they hold in their hands have both extended their childhoods and isolated them from true human interaction. As a result, they are both the physically safest generation and the most mentally fragile. Hers, however, is not the only view. A differing, though not faultless interpretation is Dana Boyd's book in 2014, It's Complicated, The Social Lives of Networked Teens. Perhaps stating the obvious, Boyd suggests that teens use social media as a way to be social, as a way to be with friends, as a way to form and be with community. They aren't all plotting to overthrow the government or lying to their parents or secretly skulking on illicit sites. Teens create and engage with community online instead of largely in person. Her assessment, Boyd's assessment, is that our young people are as committed to relationships and to community as any other generation has been at the same emerging adult period. The major difference is their physical isolation from others and their resourcefulness to still engage in community by what they perceive as the only means they have, the internet and social media. Though it is still on the early side to fully assess the impact of this virtual relationality, it is indisputable that the vast majority of Generation Z in the UK and also in the US uses social media to track, share, and comment on absolutely everything. This is the new reality of teen social life. It's conducted online for all to see and with clear messages about who's in and who's out. One impact of this, at least statistically, is that teens who spend more time on screen are more likely to be depressed, and teens who spend more time on non-screen activities are less likely to be depressed. There's no single exception in the data. All screen activities are linked to less happiness, and all non-screen activities are linked to more happiness. And so we can ask ourselves, What impact does virtual relationality have on community, on family, on trust? For those who are Christians, how does a screen impact how they relate to God, how they pray, what they fundamentally believe about themselves independent of their Facebook accounts? Now, thinking back to my encounter with Sam last Monday, she illustrates all three of these characteristics I've just surveyed. Her engagement with technology was apparent. Earphones in and eyes firmly fixed on the screen while she's walking. The concern she showed me, I experienced as a kind of inclusivism. I was outside of her relationship circle, but I wasn't outside the range of her thoughtfulness. And from what I could gather from the frank conversation we had, Sam was a nun. She had just come from a meeting with her academic advisor. Nearing the end of her first year, she was faced with the decision: does she do a degree in theology or does she go down a general humanities route? For her, it's a real dilemma because it feels like such a significant decision that will impact her future. When I told her I was in Nottingham for a theology conference and that I teach theology, there was absolutely no recognition of the coincidence of our shared interest. The problem with theology, she explained to me, is that it's focused on Western theology, and I'm interested in the religions of the world. I'm afraid I won't get that with theology. I spent some time overseas last year and came to appreciate different ways of seeing the world, she explains to me. I just want to help people find meaning in life, and I'm not sure which course of study will help me do that best. Despite the knowledge I'd been building about her age cohort, I was still surprised to see absolutely no expression of personal faith. And at the same time, her genuine desire to help people find meaning and significance however she can. As Sam stopped to go up a side street, she pointed me straight down the main road, assuring me I couldn't get lost. When she turned to go on her way, I was left feeling as if I just had an encounter with about as unpretentious a human being as exists. Her attention to a stranger was freely given. Her concern for others was real. The sobriety with which she's taking her studies was impressive. Besides just keeping me from getting lost, Sam impressed upon me the genuine strengths of this age group. Despite the particular weaknesses they may have or the specific challenges they do face, today's emerging adults have much to commend themselves to us for, to us and to the church, and we would do really well to listen long and hard. We come now to a few theological reflections on these observations. How do preferences, values, and needs of emerging adults impact their view of God, of others, and what it means to be fully human in this postmodern context? Now, let me be clear. My agenda here is not to conclude how lost this generation is, or how bright a future they may have, nor is my desire to mine our observations for the exclusive purpose of evangelism. Rather, I want to take the broad framework of theological anthropology, that simply means a Christian view of what it is to be human, and apply it to this generation for the twin purpose of engaging and equipping. James Emery White suggests that the doctrine of humanity is by far the most pressing doctrine of our age in regard to culture. It is the one area of Christian thought that is most challenged by the world in which we live. So as we go, we make 3 points in this theological anthropology: being fully human in a religionless world, being fully human in a virtual world, and being fully human in a me world. Anthropology asks the fundamental question, what is man? Who is man? And please bear with me with the gendered language for a moment, okay? Western culture has answered this question in a variety of ways. From early on, man was homo faber, the maker of tools, which has come to be termed technological man. All the way through to the most perhaps familiar version of this for us in a capitalist society, that man is consumerist man, that our end is to consume, and that in consumption we are fulfilled. Unsurprisingly, the Christian doctrine of man posits a different answer in a more fundamental category of existence. To be human is to worship. Men and women, children and elderly, postmodern and ancient, wealthy and poor, from the global south, north, east, and west, every age and every time has had religion, however varied that specific belief may be. Postmodernity's apparent rejection of religion is the exception to a very long rule of human history, that human beings will always worship something. But if it is true that worship is central to what it means to be human, what then of a culture that ignores God? What of a society that practices functional atheism? One experienced youth worker suggests that it's actually not all bad news. Because many of our emerging adults are religionless, they carry none of the baggage of earlier ones. They're open to talking about and exploring faith. They are interested and sometimes intrigued by Christianity. Now, while it's true that they don't have the same religious commitments that previous generations did, it doesn't mean that they are entirely closed to faith. In the view of Cara Powell, another youth expert, these attitudes represent more of an opportunity for the church than a challenge. How can a generation that does not know God worship God if to worship is what it means to be human? And how can worship of God then enable them to be most fully who they were created to be? If we are made to worship, then worship has everything to do with both identity and belonging. And this is true all the more so for Generation Z, as the transitional period of becoming adult is a crucible for these two essential needs: to know ourselves and to belong to others. The difficulty is that our emerging adults do not have the same kind of ready-made face-to-face communities where they can work out these questions. A handheld screen is, for many of them, the daily gauge of their identity and value. Fuller Youth Institute's article, Singing Ourselves Nowhere, suggests that corporate worship can help here. And the very act of coming together for singing, as well as other central elements of worship, we offer the opportunity to reorient ourselves to who we really are, loved and beloved by God, and unreservedly belonging to the people around us. Worship not only directs our souls and our minds and our emotions towards the proper end of our adoration, it also affirms our value as children of God and as brothers and sisters in Christ. Now, here is where the vital minority I mentioned earlier comes in. Those of our young adults who do have an active faith. These are the ones who must play an active role in serving as a bridge between their non-friends and the church, between their unreligious friends and their Christian community. Many of us, perhaps, don't have ready-made contacts with members of Generation Z, but our children and grandchildren might. And how can we be creating a public worship space that is welcoming, not just to believing emerging adults, but also to those who don't believe, but who by the same token are open to hearing about God and worshiping Him? Corporate worship might just be one way to invite them to be fully human in a religionless world. That brings us to a second challenge of being fully human in a world where relationships are conducted more by social media than by physical presence. If being made in the image of God means that humans find their true identity in coexistence with each other, then As theologian Emil Brunner asserts, true community is the ground and content of Christian humanity. True community is not only essential for being human, it is the heart of being Christian. Emerging adults are looking for this kind of relationality. A Church Times article from January of this year tells us that members of Generation Z are caring, curious, and seeking connection. 17-year-old Heather reflects this. In talking about how much she needs her social media, she vehemently argues, I can't really go and see everyone in person. I can barely hang out with my friends on the weekend, let alone people I don't talk to as often. I'm so busy. I've got lots of homework. I'm busy with track. I've got a job. And when I'm not working and doing homework, I'm hanging out with the friends I do have. But there's some people I've kind of lost contact with. And I like keeping connected to them because they're still friends. I just haven't talked to them in a while. I have no means of doing that, so Facebook makes it a lot easier for me. So what to a Gen Xer like me looks like an addiction to Snapchat or Facebook or Instagram might very well be the most obvious way to a Gen Zer of being relational, of having friendships. Indeed, one scholar from London's Kingston University suggests that relationships have actually gone some distance to fill the gap left by religion. Many young people in Britain, she writes, are largely indifferent to religion. They're not hostile to religion, but neither do they particularly engage with it, nor do they have a reason to do so, since relationships, rather than religion, are their main source of meaning. Again, I suggest the church has a role to play here. If it is true that excessive screen time can lead to a decline in mental health, then we have the opportunity to create spaces and places where a scrolling screen can be replaced by an attentive face, and where affirmation can be expressed in more than just an emoticon. Our Christian young adults have a critical role to play here as well. And there's clear evidence that they are more than ready to do so. There's a growing cohort of millennials and Generation Z who not only want to go to church, they want to be the church. Is there room for us older leaders in the church to make way for emerging adults to take responsibility in our church families? Would they be free to include their non-Christian friends at the heart of our congregations? This kind of creative relational space is imperative for being fully human in a virtual world. The third feature of being fully human is meaningful engagement beyond the self. We are creatures who have ideas. We seek beauty and truth and goodness in God and the holy. Though we are created thus, apart from God, we only know aberrations of truth and beauty and goodness and holiness, such as self-gratification, fame, and wealth. Existence that only has the physical as its end is not fully human. We are not much different than animals in this state, governed by instinct and appetite. We would do well to abandon the lie of Western Christianity that being a Christian is about my physical comfort, my security, my safety, and my blessing. The call of Christ is to lose one's life in order to save it. And this call continues to hold promise for our emerging adults because it is true. As Kinnaman puts it, young adults are interested in those martyrs' lives of jeopardy and fulfillment. Let's not fool ourselves or our young people. Following Christ involves risk, but ignoring Christ involves much greater risk, the risk of missing out. And fear of missing out is a powerful force among this generation. So how can we live this cost of the gospel in such a way as to draw young people into commitment to Christ? As strange a source as it may seem, The Guardian offers direction here. Peter Ormond writes in The Guardian just last month, "The widespread interest in extraordinarily elaborate fandoms is surely evidence that today's under-30s are quite as ready as their ancestors to commit to imaginary causes and bewildering rituals. These fan clubs, seen exquisitely, for example, in this TV series Game of Thrones, evidence a desire for something to follow, for belief in the triumph of good over evil." Ormond continues, "This may seem like a trivial point, but it does suggest a continuing appetite for community, loyalty, and a sort of tribalism that has been associated with religious belief in the past. Young people are not all the self-possessed commitment phobes of common caricature." In a world where comfort is the ultimate good and pleasure supplants meaning, there are emerging adults who see the poverty of this value system. There are many who wish to move beyond themselves and to make life better for others. It is perhaps strange to think that for those who have never heard of Jesus Christ, there can be a certain attraction to self-sacrifice. The suffering God is a mystery, yet an appealing one to a generation of looking for something or someone worthy of suffering for, and someone who is willing to suffer in love for them. Gen X parents and boomer grandparents have sought to provide the security and safety of financial stability that their own forebears did not know. Millennials and Gen Zers, however, know there is more to life than financial stability. How can we learn from our children and grandchildren in such a way that we work with them to live beyond the limits of our own lives? Will we preach and teach a gospel that is honest about the cost of discipleship in a comfortable world? We might find, as we do, that it is possible, after all, to be fully human in a me world. In all that we have said this evening, I guess in all that I've said this evening so far, we have only begun to scratch the surface of the challenge that lies before us, of loving, teaching, including, and learning from our emerging adults. For those Gen Zers who have faith and for those who do not, there is a lot at stake in our response to who they are, to their preferences, to their priorities, and to their needs. In our discussion of what it means to be truly human, the call is not just for them, but for all of us. Ultimately, to understand all the glory that God intends for us as human beings, we have to look at Jesus Christ, the one who fulfilled and fulfills the fullness of being human. Our human being will be made complete when we become like him, John tells us, remade in the image of his perfect humanity. This is not a distant aspiration. It is the real work of the Holy Spirit here and now among all generations. Our final question tonight then is, where is God at work among this generation? Where is he working through the church? And where is he working in spite of the church? Where is he birthing new life in our young adults, even if that life looks different to what we might expect? The most important thing, I think, for us, but hopefully also for you, is for you to react to some of the things I've said. I have absolutely no problem if you disagree, even with everything I've said. That's not a problem. But engage, react, agree, disagree, talk about your own experiences, ask questions. If you're really stuck, I've put up a couple questions there as well, but only go to those after you've reacted a bit to some of what we've looked at tonight.